Now help me welcome to the podium Office Lease founder and cyclist Paul Suzman to introduce our main program. Paul, come on up.
To Winston Churchill and George Orwell are attributed these words: "We sleep soundly in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who would do us harm." It is the height of the Cold War. A Soviet Akula-class submarine slips its moorings in Murmansk, and via the Bering Sea melts into the silent depths of the North Atlantic. She's almost 2 football fields in length, this pride of the Soviet first strike nuclear arsenal, capable of breaking through polar ice under which it can loiter for months. But the Akula is not alone. Another submarine stands guard, undetected but ready. And in command of this quiet ship is not a rough man, but rather a quiet, courtly man hailing from North Dakota. "Speak softly and carry a big stick," was Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Today's speaker took him literally. An only child, Bill Owens' neighborhood was a trailer park. His best friend, and who he regarded as his brother for 14 years, was a 200-pound St. Bernard. It turned out that Bernie was also an effective wingman when young Bill was angling for a date. Bill would have likely followed in his father's footsteps as a postal worker and part-time farmhand had he not enjoyed a 1957 TV series, Men of Annapolis, and decided that he wanted to be one of those young men dressed in white. So this Bismarck High School senior approached his local senator, Quentin Burdock, who nonplussed agreed to nominate him to the Naval College. Just 1 week after Bernie died, a young man who had never seen nor smelt salt water nor ventured outside North Dakota boarded a train for Annapolis, Maryland, where he launched himself into a life story worthy of Horatio Alger. After graduating with a degree in mathematics from Annapolis and with the promise of a Rhodes Scholarship, he served in Vietnam commanding a riverine patrol boat. He then set off for New College, Oxford. Over the doors of this storied 14th century college are engraved the words, "Manners maketh man," words that have informed Bill Owens throughout his varied career. At Oxford, he read for the classic PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. During his first semester, one of his tutors, a self-important Don, judged his warrior student's writing as lacking creativity and suggested that perhaps he was not cut out for the exacting standards demanded at Oxford. Unfazed, Bill went on to graduate with honors. While serving on submarines, he earned another master's degree, this time in management from George Washington University, again with honors. After assuming command of the U.S. Navy's 6th Fleet, Admiral Owens served as Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the country's 2nd highest military post. Upon retirement from the military, Admiral Owens became CEO of Science Applications International, and then was CEO of Nortel and several other companies. He was chair of CenturyLink and has served on the board of numerous public companies, including Daimler-Benz. After living in Hong Kong for 7 years, running an international investment group, he now calls the shores of Lake Washington home. If you have had the privilege of spending time with him, you will learn about his role models, people like Dick Gephardt, Tung Chee-hwa, former governor of Hong Kong, and Asim Premji, the first Indian billionaire to sign Bill Gates's giving pledge. But foremost, he would tell you about his mentors, men who lead by example, laced with a genuine love of those for whom they were responsible, and who valued the joy of teamwork above all else. Today, Admiral Owens will share with us how he perceives the next 20 years unfurling for the United States. So fellow Rotarians and guests, please help me welcome to our podium Admiral Bill Owens, who, as did our own Admiral Bill Center, quietly gave of himself so the rest of us could all sleep soundly in our beds, safe from those who would do us harm.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was really nice. And I'm honored to be with Rotarians. I admire your organization enormously and have a huge respect for everything that you do individually and as a group. I want to acknowledge a few people in the audience who are my heroes. Bill Center, it's great to see you again. And Tom Hayward, who was my mentor and a guy who made a real difference in my life when he was the #1 guy in the Navy and lives in Seattle. And Tom is, as I said, a special hero. Father Steve is here. I sit on the board of Seattle University, and I admire Father Steve and everything he's done with that great university, very close here. And there are several others in the audience. I wanted to talk to you a little bit from the heart. I've had a blessing of being around the world a lot and seeing a lot of things. I admire what you're doing in malaria. The pain and agony of the world is striking to me. And what a blessing we have to be in this great country and lead these great lives. I think that separate from what is going on in Washington today are the two great issues that face our country. And I want to talk to you about those because I truly believe that they are exactly that, our great issues, and I think we're paying hardly enough attention to them. I'll dispense with one quickly, and that's the national debt. Many of us who have served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff agree that the largest security threat to the United States today is the national debt. I'm struck that Washington hardly mentions the national debt. But you can watch it on your cell phone. I do every day. This morning it's $22,837 billion, and it's going up very fast. In a booming economy, it's going up very fast. $1 trillion a year. So we are now at a level that Greece was at when Greece went bankrupt. And I'm struck that we're doing very little to handle the spending in the country and to resolve this, because our kids will pay for this. I promise, our kids will pay for this. We've never seen this in the United States since World War II, when we went into debt substantially. But this is a huge issue for our country, and it's not getting the attention that it either deserves or one day will bring us down. And there is no activity to fix it in the Congress, in the parties, in the presidency, and I just urge you to keep an eye on that because it's really bad. So the other great issue is one I speak with somewhat passionately, and that is the future of the United States and China. And in that regard, I think that the United States and China can be great friends. And nobody wants to say that, but if you look at our history with China, there is a lot of reason to believe that we could be very close to the Chinese. The World War II, there's a great book called The Forgotten Ally. And I would just tell you that if you read that book, the Chinese, I believe, were perhaps the ones who won the Second World War. You don't think of them that way, but some of my military heroes are guys like General Stilwell and Chennault, who lived out in Chengdu in the western part of China and did all they could to protect the Chinese from the onslaught of the Japanese, which was terrible. The rape and pillage of Nanjing was historically one of the worst events we've ever seen, and the Chinese lost 20 million people, the same number that the Russians lost in World War II. We are very close to the Chinese. If you get to know the Chinese, you know, you have to find a great partnership in your spirit about who they are and who we are. And so it hurts me a lot when we hear what's going on in Washington. We're very different from the Chinese. We culturally find it very difficult to do business with the Chinese. I've tried a lot. I've done some of it successfully. I've done a lot of it unsuccessfully. But basically, they are different from the way we are. They think long term. I mean, today, look at what China is thinking about and talking about. The Belt and Road Initiative that will change 65 nations in the world to link them together, places that have very little future hope, all of Central Asia, a lot of the places where terrorism is spawned. The Chinese are building out, and we take a lot of shots at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in our press and our media. It's a great vision. It's a long-term vision. I happen to think we should find ways to cooperate with it. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a large organization that helps nations to grow and to facilitate some financing for the things they do. The Chinese are not all good, for sure. I also don't think that we put them in the communist role quite like the Soviet Union was. The Chinese are not the Soviet Union. Paul mentioned that I spent my life in the Cold War, and I spent I guess, 3,000 days of my life underwater. My wife says that's the reason you are the way you are. And there's some truth to that. You know, imagine being in this sewer pipe with 150 men for 80 days at a time. Tom Hayward made me do that. And it was something that was, you know, it causes your whole awareness to change about what matters a lot and what doesn't matter a lot. And I think in the spirit of what matters a lot, we want to build a friendship with the Chinese because this is not the Soviet Union. It is not the Soviet Union. It's much larger. And I want to just tell you about a project that I'm undertaking. And Tom and several others have been very helpful to me in terms of looking at this. And that is the attempt to try to put together a short book that talks about China and the United States in 2039, with the idea of what should we have done in 2019 to get ready for that. And since the Chinese plan long term, as I said, and so do we plan for next week, they plan for 2 decades from now, I think it's really important for us to try to make an effort to think about what that's going to be like in 20 years. And there's a lot of consensus about what it's going to be like. We know a lot about what it's going to be like. So why wouldn't we expose ourselves to that and start taking some actions to try to make a difference in that world that is going to look really different in 2039? Title of the book is China US 2039, the end game, ? And I think it could very well determine the future of your children and mine and our country. So it's a serious activity. I am a proud American. I want to tell you, first of all, I want a strong military. I want a good military budget. But for the 2 reasons I've mentioned, our lack of attention to our relationship with China and the national debt, a lot of that will fall apart, surprisingly, in 20 years. So in 20 years, China will be larger than we are, not only in buying power, but in absolute GDP. And we say to ourselves, yeah, but they've got 1.4 billion people. Yeah, but they've got a lot more middle-income people today than we have in the United States. That means people who are living a pretty nice life, they own their own house, they go on vacations, they have a car, they're sending a child to college. Middle-income people, they have more than we have, substantially more. The society has made more people better off in a short period of time than any society in the history of man. They've got 17 borders, all of which are contentious in one way or another. We have 2 borders, and I guess neither of them are under threat from being attacked from those nations. The Chinese worry about that, and they have for the last 1,000 years. And we should realize that they have worried about it, and they still have these conflicts about those borders. They want to assure the future of a great nation of Chinese. They have never taken land and held it in 1,000 years. They have never taken land and held it in 1,000 years. So they have a little border skirmish going on with 37 million square miles on the border of India. The Indians became a little aggressive. The Chinese mobilized and, pardon my language, beat the crap out of the Indians in about 2 weeks, moved into the land, and then came back to the borderline. They have never taken people's land and held it. So they're a proud nation. They see themselves in the future as wanting to establish a proud nation, and they're on their pathway through these visions, Belt and Road Initiative, AIIB, being #1 in the world in artificial intelligence. That should mean something to us in Seattle, and paving a way to a better future for their people, one that is secure in a nation that has been besieged with nations that came and took advantage of them. The Japanese, the cocaine wars, a lot of things went on that affected the Chinese. So in 20 years, they'll be larger than we are. They could have a much larger military if they chose. We measure militaries by percentage of GDP. 3 or 4% is an acceptable amount. They've got a larger GDP. They can fund a larger military than we can. They will have many, many more science and technology graduates. They will definitely be #1 in the world. I can give you a lot of stories of things I've seen in China, in places like Hangzhou or Shenzhen, that are more advanced than we are today in technology. And they will have some issues. Their elderly problem will be large, but so will ours. And so there are many things that will be negative, but we need to remember that for our children, this will be #1 and will be #2 in terms of the size of nations. Now, I happen to believe that there's huge synergy between us. And so we've made about 10 recommendations in this book about things we should do. We should cooperate on things like the national security of Asia, and we should form a group. There's no discussion point today for issues that come up in Asia. We should form one of those. I can tell you the Chinese want to do that. We have resisted. We should look at ways that we can bring peace to nations that are troubled. North Korea, Venezuela, Iran. We should find ways to work together, remembering that we're working with a country that's going to be #1 in the world. We should have people-to-people programs that really matter, led by the Vice President of the United States and the Premier of China, Li Keqiang. These are military to military, educators to educators, people to people, but hugely increased from the way it is today. We have 300,000 Chinese students in America today. We should welcome them. And we should try to include our kids in a future that could be going to China a lot more and learning about what the Chinese are. And there are 7 or 8 other recommendations that I think we should do today, and many of the people in this little group that have helped me to put together this book believe is true. So I don't know how to tell that story in Washington, but I can tell you that's not a popular story, and maybe it's not a popular story in this room, but I've tried to bring Chinese business and Chinese money to Seattle. I can give you some stories that are really not very positive. We somehow don't like the fact that the Chinese are here in the United States owning a lot of things, doing a lot of things. There's something wrong with that. I have been personally close to the founder of Huawei. Don't tell anybody who has influence that I am. But, you know, there's a lot of story with Huawei, and there's a lot of goodness in Huawei, and I don't know if they have violated or not. I can tell you that at one time, I was the CEO of a company that did exactly the same thing that Huawei does, the largest in the world. And that relationship led me to understand a little bit about what the CEOs of companies like that are exposed to in their own government situations. So we need to look carefully before we make these political decisions to outlaw companies that we don't completely understand, but we're all too ready to do that. So I'm told that I have just a couple more minutes, and then I'm here to sing the North Dakota State song to you in 13 languages, answer any questions you might have, and talk more about all of this if you'd like to do that. Bill Center said that I came from North Dakota. I guess Paul said I came from North Dakota. I did come from North Dakota, and I had never been out of the state when I was 18. That's how North Dakota winds up with more per capita admirals than any state in the country. If I had known how bad it was going to be, you know, it might have been different. So I'll just leave my comments with that, and remembering that Theodore Roosevelt was someone who really loved North Dakota. And he spent a lot of his later years in Medora, North Dakota. I would ask all of you to look inside yourselves. One of the great things that Theodore Roosevelt said was, "Bullfight critics ranked in rows fill the enormous plaza full, but there is only one who knows, and that's the man who fights the bull." So if you believe in these things, stand up for them. Stand up for them in the media, stand up for them in what you say or write. If you have dinner time conversations and you're the only one who believes these things, but you believe them, stand up for them. I think these two issues that I've raised to you today are so critically important for our kids, and I'm a little bit ashamed of us that we don't stand up for these kinds of issues. So I thank you very much for listening to me today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I don't know how this works at our Rotary here, but I'm glad to take questions, sing my North Dakota State song in Chinese. Yes, sir. How do we follow it? I'll give you the app in a little while. If you go to an app called Monex, M-O-N-E-X, and you look, it'll tell you the price of gold, the price of silver, and the U.S. national debt. And it shows it day to day.
First question over here.
I was in Tibet a couple years ago, and the Chinese have just come in to take over Tibet. Could you talk about Tibet a little?
Yeah, I think Tibet is one of those places that, you know, is very hard for us to deal with. I would have to say it's one that I don't understand well enough. Tibet is a place where the Chinese have come. They viewed it as being their land. There's some historical relevance to that, but they have changed Tibet. And, you know, if you look at everything with the Dalai Lama, did he really live in Tibet? What was the state of the Tibetan people before the Chinese came? It was not very good. The living standards were much lower. The Chinese came and they put a lot of investment into Tibet. But at the same time, they took away a lot of the Tibetan traditions. And so I think it's a little mixed about Tibet. I must say, it's the hardest country that I have to answer a question about when it comes to the subject of Chinese aggression.
Next question here.
Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for your comments on the debt. I totally understand your point of view on the hypocrisy, especially after the Snowden revelations and the infrastructure issue. A lot of people don't understand that from an American versus China perspective. Could you comment on that briefly? And then lastly, as it relates to the islands developing in the North China Sea, because in the West, that seems to be the other issue that I think puzzles or troubles some in the West.
Well, thank you for the questions. We often like to look at these things from our experience and what we know, and not the other side. And so on both of these issues, I think the issue is, have you ever heard the Chinese side of the story? And so and that applies to both of the points you raise. Have you ever heard the Chinese side of the story? And I would say to most of you in the room, you've never heard it. And I would say to you that when you do hear it, it's pretty convincing, just like ours is very convincing. And that means that we should have real discussions about these areas and these kinds of things. So let me give you a 2-minute lecture on the South China Sea from the Chinese standpoint. The South China Sea is historically something that we Chinese have staked out for many, many years, and there's a historical record of the 9-dash line. For a long time, we talked to the United States about it. At the end of World War II, we had a few side letters on the South China Sea that we read as being United States pseudo-agreement with the 9-dash line at the end of World War II. We always tried to jointly develop the area for resources with the countries that are in the South China Sea. But what we noticed a few years after World War II was that several countries around the South China Sea started to drill for oil. The Philippines drilled 500 wells. I think the Vietnamese drilled about 1,000 wells. We didn't drill any. We wanted to jointly develop. And then we noticed that there was a lot of fishing going on in the contested areas, which we had stayed away from. And then we noticed that there were small military encampments being built by the Filipinos and by the Vietnamese in the South China Sea. And then we got a lot of pressure from this large and growing middle class in China that started to notice, what is this in the contested area of the South China Sea that these other nations are doing something, and we thought that we had a strong claim for the area, and we should stand up to do something. And so we decided that we would do something, and we built a large island, which we have not to date used much for military purposes, but it was a little bit of a stake in the ground. Now, that's not totally true, but a lot of what I just said is true. And so that's the Chinese side of that story. And what it's taught me is that there are two sides to almost every one of these stories, but in our news media, you never hear the other side. You could go to another app called CGTV, which is the Chinese CNN, basically, and you could hear a very different set of news. Or the South China Morning Post is another one. That's a free press out of Hong Kong. And you could see a number of different stories from what we see, and so that is a part of the reality of the way we are today. We hear the story from what we know, but we frequently don't hear the story from what they think. And I think that pertains to dozens and dozens of issues. So there are great opportunities if we tell each other the story as we know it, and then we do something about it. I'll just conclude by saying over the last 10 years, philanthropically, I and a couple of other men, I think, are wonderful men of the world. Hank Greenberg, 90-some years old, was the guy who built AIG into the company it has turned out to be. Great fan of China. Tung Chee-hwa, the first Chinese governor of Hong Kong, and myself have been sponsoring something called the Sanya Initiative, which brings together 5 old American generals and admirals, all 4 stars, with 5 similar guys from China. And I can tell you we do it twice a year. I know them well. One of the guys, the senior guy, is this tall. And I sing the North Dakota State song to him in Chinese. He loves it. Old Chinese men love to hold hands, and I love to hold his hand. And we talk about how our nations really could be something much greater and how we should never wind up shooting at each other. And we care. And so a lot of that is possible by building trust between our nations. And I see the warden from Australia here is telling me time is up. So it's just a real pleasure to be with you folks. I tell you honestly, thank you.